and we really appreciate him taking time to come clear up here to Minersville and share his experiences with us. So we'll turn time over to you, Roger.
I don't know if I've ever gotten a clap beforehand, so it's pretty special. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I'm pretty much just like Nikki. I'm a cooperative extension specialist at UC Davis, and I deal with it's kind of the same things, anything from ag pests to urban and residential areas and natural resource areas as well, all the way from small rodents up to bears and lions and things like that. So it's pretty broad and diverse. But that being said, I probably spent more time on rodents in agricultural settings than anything else, in particular pocket gophers and ground squirrels. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the work that I've been involved with in researching some of our ground squirrel species in California, as well as some of my past colleagues who've been really working on this issue for many decades now. And hopefully the information that I'm able to provide based on some of the management tools that we use for ground squirrels in California will be able to translate over to some of the issues that you have here in Utah. I'm going to be talking specifically about two species today of ground squirrel. One is the California ground squirrel, which is pretty much ubiquitous throughout most of California. Then we also have the Belding's ground squirrel. Belding's ground squirrel is found primarily in the northeastern part of the state. The Belding's ground squirrel is a lot more similar. Let's see, do I have a laser pointer?
Yeah, there should be.
Hey, because it's too far to walk over there. The Belding's ground squirrel is a lot more similar to the ground squirrel species you have here in Utah as well. Just a little bit of background information though. These are the California ground squirrels. They look a lot more like standard tree squirrels do. They are grayish brown in color. They oftentimes have a semi-bushy tail. That tail isn't quite as bushy as it would be for an eastern fox squirrel, western gray squirrel, etc. The Belding's ground squirrel is a little bit smaller. Certainly not near the tail length. It looks a lot different. Both of these species, though, as all ground squirrel species are social. So you do find them in groups. They're also diurnal, means they're active during the daytime, and that has some implications for management as well. The damage that they cause can be quite extensive and quite varied. It can include direct consumption of the vegetation itself. So certainly that's a very common form of damage in crops like alfalfa. But in California, we have a lot of tree and vine crops as well. And so we see a lot of girdling damage of trees and vines caused by particularly California ground squirrels. Chewing on irrigation lines is a real big issue for us in California. It results in many millions of dollars of damage annually in replacing those irrigation lines. And their abundant burrow openings cause lots of problems as well, some of which you're all familiar with. They can damage farm equipment, can lower quality of hay, can result in loss of irrigation water, which can lead to channeling, therefore increase soil erosion issues. So a lot of those kinds of common problems that we have with ground squirrels. Now for managing ground squirrels, this is something that's already been alluded to a little bit today, but we do try to focus on using an integrated approach. And by integrated approach, what I'm talking about is using multiple techniques. We find much better success when we use multiple techniques than when we rely on any single one approach. In part because not all individuals in a population are going to be equally susceptible to each management tool out there. And also because not all management tools work equally well throughout the year. So those are all different components to consider, but just an example of how you might use an integrated approach would be to use bait stations to bait for ground squirrels at certain times of the year, but then at other times of the year, use of burrow fumigants can be more effective as well. And we'll talk about all these different tools as we move on today. And the other item that certainly I want to stress, and it's something that's already been pointed out today, is it is really important to know a little bit about the biology of the species that you're dealing with, as well as the ecology of the system that you're working in, because this can greatly influence the management of many of the different tools that we have for dealing with ground squirrels. And this particular chart was developed for the California ground squirrel. I think it does a really good job of helping to illustrate the importance of some of these different components. So what we have on this chart are major activity periods for ground squirrels, major food sources, and then the best time for control for 3 of the more commonly used techniques for managing California ground squirrels. And that's broken down, of course, across the different seasons of the year. So what do we see with this chart? Well, one of the things that we see is that for California ground squirrels in the springtime, they're eating primarily green foliage. This is important because most of the baits that we use for ground squirrel control are in fact seed or pelletized type baits. But California ground squirrels don't start eating seeds until later in the year. So baiting for California ground squirrels is generally only effective later in the year when they're actively feeding on seeds. If we try to use bait in the springtime, we usually don't have very good success because they're primarily interested in eating that green vegetation. So that's one limitation. So if we want to use something to manage ground squirrels in the springtime, one of the tools we like to use is burrow fumigation. This works quite well in springtime, doesn't work so well later in the year. And the reason why is in California we have a Mediterranean climate, which means we get most of our moisture in the winter through early spring. And soil moisture is really important for burrow fumigants. It closes off the pores in the soil and it holds those toxic gases in at a much greater rate. As that soil dries out, it creates a lot larger pores, cracks in the soil, etc. And those gases can dissipate from those burrow systems at a much greater rate. So they do not work near as well in dry conditions. And for some of the products like aluminum phosphide, it just doesn't work at all if you're dealing with dry soil conditions. So in California, fumigation works quite well in spring, not so well later in the year. So these are just a couple of examples of how knowing a little bit about the species that you're dealing with, as well as the ecology of the system that you're working in, can greatly increase the efficacy of a management program. So that begs the question, then what tools do we have for managing ground squirrels? And at least when it comes to the California ground squirrel species, we actually do have a wide variety of tools that can work. Belding's ground squirrel, we have more limitations, and that's going to be felt by you guys as well, because Belding's is much more similar to the Townsend or Paiute ground squirrel, and so we do see those limitations there. But for California ground squirrels, habitat modification is a tool that can be used and can be effective, and I'll provide an example of that. It's something that Mark's already talked a little bit about as well. I have the question mark there for Belding's ground squirrel because most of the problems we have with Belding's are in alfalfa fields, and alfalfa is already the ideal habitat for these species, and so there's not necessarily a whole lot we can do from a habitat management perspective within an alfalfa field. Bait application and burrow fumigation are 2 of the primary tools that we use for managing ground squirrel species, both ground squirrel species, and so certainly we'll be talking about that. Trapping is a somewhat effective tool for California ground squirrels. It's not all that practical for Belding's ground squirrel. Once again, why I have the question mark there. If you do have...
Why do you see a difference there, Roger? What do you think? Why do you think it's...
So one of the primary differences is simply population density. We don't usually see quite as high densities with California ground squirrels as we do with Belding's ground squirrel. And so if you have, hundreds of squirrels running around out there, trapping just becomes too labor intensive. It's not that you can't catch them like you found. You can catch them. It's just a very labor intensive, time consuming process. And so it's not usually as practical for Belding's as it would be for California ground squirrels. Exclusion, this is not something I'm going to talk a lot about today, but I will briefly mention there was some work done by some predecessors of mine on the use of exclusionary fencing for keeping Belding's ground squirrels out of alfalfa fields. And they were apparently fairly effective. They had actually about 90% reduction in movement into fields. What they were using was basically tin from roofs that you'd put on houses and sheds. They'd bury them. I don't remember exactly how far they would bury them, but maybe a couple of feet or so below ground, and then it would extend for maybe 2 to 3 feet above ground. So it's very costly to do. Obviously pretty labor intensive to put this out there. But if you're going to have an alfalfa stand that's in for many years and you can keep the ground squirrels out, then it might be cost effective long term. So I'll just mention that. I have no idea if this would be practical in any way, shape, or form around here, but it is something that was done a little bit for Belding's and was effective for them. Repellents and frightening devices, you'll find them marketed for all kinds of species. They don't typically work well for most species, and so that's about all we're going to say on those today. And then shooting is another tool that can be used, certainly can be effective if individuals are diligent with it, and we'll talk about that as well. That list was just a small list of different options that we have for managing some of these species, and we're going to talk about some additional tools other than what was just listed on that chart previously, but those are some of the more common ones we hear talked about. But another one that wasn't on that chart that is oftentimes discussed is biocontrol, and this is something that's been discussed a little bit today as well. With biocontrol, though, we're basically talking about the use of natural predation to help control these pest populations. One of the more common examples that we see, at least in California, is the use of owl boxes, basically putting up owl boxes to encourage owls to roost in them and then hopefully hunt in those areas. Well, aside from the fact of whether or not owl boxes can work for some species, we won't get into that discussion today, but I can tell you that they won't work well for ground squirrels because ground squirrels are diurnal, owls are nocturnal. So they're not existing on the same time plane. So owls are not going to be much of a management tool for you. Other raptor species, though, could at least potentially be hawks, eagles. They certainly do feed on ground squirrels. But at this point in time, I have never seen any study that has shown that encouraging increased use by raptors will substantially lower any of these ground squirrel populations. There actually have been some studies done in California that has looked at erecting these raptor perches to see if that could have some kind of positive influence on reducing ground squirrel populations, and it had no impact whatsoever. So at this point in time, it's not something that we really encourage as a management tool. Certainly it doesn't hurt. We know that these species do predate on ground squirrels, but there's really not a lot of reason to believe that they're probably going to substantially reduce those pest populations. Another tool, though, that can be used for managing ground squirrels is habitat modification, particularly for California ground squirrels. This is a tool that we can use. And as I mentioned, we have a lot of tree crops. Here's an example of an almond orchard in California. And ground squirrels, as you might guess, love nuts. So they have lots of problems in almond orchards with California ground squirrels. Well, they go through these orchards annually and prune them, and then they put those pruning piles on the edge of these orchards, and these pruning piles are really ideal habitats for ground squirrels and for a lot of other species as well. So if they then go through and try to manage ground squirrels in the orchard but ignore these pruning piles, what can happen is we can get rid of the ground squirrels out here, but now these ground squirrels just simply run right back into the orchard, repopulate that area, and now you've got the same problem all over again. So getting rid of these pruning piles would be an example of how you can use habitat modification to increase the efficacy of a management program. I stress this is pretty much just for California ground squirrels. For Beldings, we don't have a lot of great examples, and so I don't know if there's a whole lot other than what Mark has already mentioned as potential for habitat modification for ground squirrels here in Utah. One other tool, though, that we have talked a little bit about that can be used in some situations is trapping. Trapping is particularly useful when dealing with relatively small populations. As we've already stressed, it's not overly practical for larger populations of ground squirrels. But trapping does have some positive attributes to it. One of the positive attributes is that it is effective year-round as long as ground squirrels are active. So we come back to this chart again, and you see that fumigation primarily in springtime, baiting primarily in summer and into fall, but trapping is effective year-round as long as the ground squirrels are active. That's the key component there. So it is a nice tool to have in your toolbox because it allows you some versatility on management from that perspective. The other really nice attribute of trapping is that it can be a good alternative or follow-up approach. So thinking back to one of the first slides, we do want to use an integrated program when it comes to managing these species. And so you may use bait application to reduce the population in a given area, and that maybe you get 80 or 90% reduction in population size in an area from a bait application. That's really good, but you'd really rather get rid of all of them, or at least almost all of them. But after a bait application, probably what's happened is most of the individuals in that population that are going to consume that bait have done so. The other remaining individuals may not want to consume that bait. They may simply not desire what you're putting out there. But if you use trapping to come back through and target those few remaining individuals, that's a way to further reduce those populations. And so trapping can be effective from that perspective as well. There are a lot of different kinds of traps out there, and we've covered most of these already. These traps can basically fall into two categories, and those are live traps and kill traps. Examples of kill traps include body gripping traps such as the Conibear 110. These are used quite a bit for California ground squirrel control. We also have tube or tunnel style traps such as what are provided in the back of the room. And then we also have box type squeeze traps. These are more or less the gopher box traps that we use. Those can be used for ground squirrels, and I'll show an example of that in a couple of slides. And then we also have the live traps such as the have-a-heart or tomahawk style live traps. We have examples of those, as well as the multi-catch traps. There are certainly situations in which you may want to use kill traps. There are situations in which you may want to use the live traps. The kill traps tend to be a little bit more efficacious than the live traps are, just because it's easier to get the animals into those traps. And so that's one potential advantage. The other advantage is that it does take care of the killing process for you. So you don't have to do the euthanizing after you capture them. And so that's another added benefit. The downside is, though, is these are non-selective. So if you get a cat or a dog or something like that in one of these traps, it's going to kill it just as quickly as it will a ground squirrel. So you have to be careful where you use these kill traps. If you're trapping in areas where you're concerned about non-target captures, that's where these live traps come into play. And they certainly can be effective tools in some situations. The one thing that we always have to stress, at least in California, is that if you do use these live traps and you do capture the target animal, you are responsible for euthanizing the animal after capture. And this may seem quite obvious to all of you, but it's not always quite obvious to some people in residential areas. They oftentimes say, well, can't we just take the ground squirrel somewhere else and let it go? I just don't want it on my property, right? I don't want to kill it. And we always have to tell them that the short answer is no. It's against the law to translocate animals, at least without a permit. So you are responsible for euthanizing the animal after capture. And one of the big reasons why is there's a real potential for disease transmittance with these species. And this was mentioned a little bit earlier today, particularly in reference to plague. Trust me, plague is not something you want to be spreading around, even if it does get rid of some of the ground squirrels for you. Plague is quite deadly to all animals, including people. And so we don't want to see any kind of increase in spread of diseases that are going to negatively impact us in that capacity either. So do remember, you do have to euthanize. Shooting is oftentimes the easiest tool that we have available. The other tool that we generally recommend is the use of carbon dioxide gas chambers. Sounds scary, sounds expensive, but it's not really. You can buy some commercial gas chamber type devices online, or you can make your own. There are websites that show you how to make your own out of a cooler. But basically it's just a CO2 tank. A regulator allows you to pump carbon dioxide into a large cooler. You put the traps into the cooler, basically causes the ground squirrel to fall asleep and then die. And the benefit of those is that you can do many traps at once if you have a large enough container. People who do a lot of trapping will actually just take toolboxes and convert them into a gas chamber, and you can just pump carbon dioxide into that and euthanize a lot of ground squirrels at once using that approach. So that is something that can be used. Just a little bit of quick information on some of the traps that we use. I mentioned that we do use the Conibear 110s. These are placed at the entrance of burrow systems. The theory then is the ground squirrel runs in or runs out, triggers the trap, and they get caught. One of the things about these traps, though, you have to have them over just about every opening you have out there, or the squirrels will just go down the other openings that aren't covered up. So, and sometimes you find nice fresh openings right next to the trap. They just don't want to go into it. So it's a bit of an art. It does take some practice, but these can work. We also can treat the conibears in a manner similar to a box trap, such as the have-a-heart or tomahawk style. basically just creating a box where you can slide the trap inside of it, put some bait in the back end, and now you can bait the animals into the trap, but now it acts effectively as a kill trap rather than having to use a live trap and euthanize the animal after capture. These actually can also be modified to exclude other targets, non-target species. So for example, there are designs for a kill trap type device like this that can be used in areas where we have San Joaquin kit foxes. They are an endangered species in California, but they are found around a lot of ground squirrel areas. And what you can do is actually extend, so you'll have the trap a little bit further back, and this part will extend out a little bit, and it'll have a narrowing at the opening, basically just a couple of inches or so wide, so that the squirrels can crawl inside that and then get to the trigger mechanism and get caught, but it will exclude larger species like foxes. And so there's a lot of adaptations that can be made to these to make them a little bit more species specific. We also do use gopher box traps, oftentimes set in tandem. We sprinkle a little bit of bait down the middle of it and put them next to runways. The ground squirrels run in and get caught. Tube or tunnel style traps work in the same manner. And then, of course, we've already talked a lot about live traps. They can be used, and I won't discuss that too much more today. That takes us to baiting. Baiting is one of, if not probably the primary tool used to manage particularly California ground squirrels. Of course, with baiting, we're talking about the use of toxic baits. We have basically two different materials that we can use. These are first-generation anticoagulants and zinc phosphide. The first-generation anticoagulants are chlorphacinone and diphacinone, like we've already talked about today. These are multiple feed materials, so the animals do have to have access to the bait for multiple days for it to work. Zinc phosphide is an acute toxicant. It kills after a single feed, so that means it's a much quicker acting product. Now, we've talked a little bit about anticoagulants today, and the anticoagulants that we have available for ground squirrel control are the first generation anticoagulants. These are not to be confused with the second generation anticoagulants. The second generation anticoagulants include brodifacoum, bromodiolone, difethiolone, and difenacoum. These are your rat and mouse poisons. So if you think about decon, that was always historically brodifacoum. Now, all of those second generation anticoagulant products are no longer available for homeowners. So if you go to the store and buy decon these days, it's no longer brodifacoum. They had to change the label. It's now diphacinone, so it's not near as effective probably as it once was. But the reason, the reason that they made these changes is that these second generation products are much more toxic. And so they build up to much higher levels in the body of the target animal. And so we've started to see a lot of problems with secondary toxicity, which is where the target animal consumes the product, they die, scavengers come along, feed on those carcasses, then they get a toxic dose as well. And so the second generation products basically have been removed from homeowner use. It's very difficult to find them unless you're a professional applicator these days. All that being said, I just wanted to provide that as background information because regardless of the registration process of these products, they've never been available for ground squirrel control. It's always just been the first generation anticoagulant products that are available. And
So you don't expect that they'll ever be available?
No. And even historically, that was never going to happen because when we think about the first generation products like diphacinone and chlorphacinone, what happens, the animal ingests it and it lasts for a while in the body. The half-life for these are somewhere around maybe 7 to 10 days, maybe 2 weeks for the first generation anticoagulants. For things like brodifacoum, it's 250 days. So these things persist in the body for a really long period of time, allows them to biomagnify to really high levels. And these products are much, much more toxic than these first generation anticoagulants. And so if you use them on things like ground squirrels and voles and animals like that, you'd have lots of carcasses above ground. You'd get lots of secondary kill that way. And so, yeah, they never were going to be registered for that use.
For mice and rats.
Mice and rats exclusively. Yeah. Now, as far as these first generation products are concerned, there are 3 primary ways that we apply these baits. These are through spot treatments, broadcast applications, and in bait stations. Spot treatments are generally used when you just have a few burrow systems that need to be treated. With this, you're basically taking a designated amount of bait, and with the first generation anticoagulants, that's usually somewhere around 1/4 cup to 1/3 of a cup of bait, and then you're spreading that very thinly around the entrance of the opening. Now, you have to read each label because each label will tell you exactly what they want you to do, but in general terms, for what we use for California ground squirrels, it's usually 1/3 of a cup spread around 40 to 50 square feet. I always like to stress this because most people don't realize how big of an area 40 to 50 square feet is. It's actually quite a large area. What you don't want to do is take that bait and dump it on the ground right there next to the opening, because now you've essentially piled up bait, and all kinds of animals can come along and eat that pile of bait and get a toxic dose. But if you spread it out very thinly over that 40 to 50 square foot area, the ground squirrels have no problem picking up enough of that to get a toxic dose, but most of the other animals do not have that capability. So you don't have to worry about poisoning deer, pronghorn, other animals like that. But if you pile it up, then you do have to worry about that. That is a real potential concern. So spot treatments certainly can be effective for small areas. For larger areas, the broadcast applications are much more practical. That's where you use the seed spreader, either on the back of an ATV or on a belly grinder, belly style grinder, or something like that. It can be a very effective tool for treating larger areas. And in some cases, you need to use bait stations as well. Maybe you can't do direct bait application in a field, such as it with alfalfa. Oftentimes, bait stations are also used along the perimeter or the edge of fields to help you intercept some of those reinvading squirrels onto your property. So bait stations certainly have a lot of potential uses from that perspective. The other obvious benefit...
Have you ever broke that grain up a little bit, crushed it or anything other than full big pieces and made it work?
So if you get too small, it becomes it's more or less just dust anymore, and it doesn't work as well.
Maybe split it or make it more easy to carry?
So you're talking more along the lines of the pelletized baits?
Or just make it a little bit smaller than a big piece of grain.
So if it's the grain, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. I mean, you could crack something like wheat or something along those lines. I've never seen anybody do anything along those lines, in part because, at least for California ground squirrels, we don't typically have a problem with bait acceptance. They take grain quite readily. Belding's ground squirrel is a whole nother issue. Belding's does not take grain very well, so it would be similar to the squirrels you have here. So it varies a lot depending upon the species that we're talking about. And maybe it's something that could be looked at, but generally speaking, the whole grain is a sufficient mechanism for getting it to them. But yeah, broadcast application, oh, I'm sorry, we did broadcast. So bait stations, the other advantage of bait stations, of course, is the fact that you can limit access to the bait by putting that opening there. In other words, animals larger than that opening can't get inside and gain access to the bait. So from a primary toxicity perspective, it's a little bit safer to use. That being said, oftentimes people look at bait stations as being the safest tool to use regardless, and that's not really necessarily true. With bait stations, what you're doing is you're creating a ready bait supply. With these first generation anticoagulants, they'll feed for 5 to 10 days on these products. It takes at least 3 to 5 days of feeding to get a toxic dose, and it takes anywhere from 5 to 12 days for mortality to set in. And they don't usually feel the ill effects of that until towards the very end. And so what you're doing is you're feeding squirrels a whole lot of bait for a number of days. And so that can build up that toxic levels in the body to a relatively high rate. And so secondary toxicity actually can be greater with the bait station approach than with a broadcast or a spot treatment approach.
I was reading online about how far to put the bait stations apart. Do you have any recommendations?
So the recommendation is basically dependent upon the density of ground squirrels that you have in an area. The labels that I'm familiar with usually say anywhere from 20 to 100 feet apart. And that's really just designated to let you have that flexibility to set however many you need based upon the density that you have. The general recommendation, if you're using like one of those upside down T-shaped bait stations, is to put about 3 to 5 pounds of grain in them and then come back and check them after a day or two. If all that grain is gone after a day or two, then you need to put more bait stations out. And so if you started off maybe 70 feet apart, now maybe you'll put them 35 feet apart, and you'll just have to put more bait stations out there. But that's a really important point about using these first generation anticoagulants, is that these are multiple feed materials. And if they aren't feeding on these baits every 3 to 5 days at a minimum, then they're not going to work. So if you put a bait station out there and the squirrels eat all of that bait in 1 or 2 days and you don't refill that bait for a week, all you're really doing is feeding squirrels. And you're also increasing the possibility that they will develop a resistance to this product, which is a very real possibility when it comes to these anticoagulants. They can develop resistance to these products. So you really need to make sure that you're maintaining that constant bait supply if you're going to use bait stations. If you're using spot treatments or broadcast applications, you have to reapply that bait at least a second time around 4 days after that initial application. Or once again, you're basically just feeding squirrels. And so it is very important that you realize that. Follow the label, make sure that you're getting that bait to them at the appropriate times. Otherwise, it will not work for you. Now, one of the nice things, so there are several different kinds of bait stations out there. And we've kind of covered this a little bit. Here's an example of one of the commercial style bait stations, and certainly they can work. And there's an example of one of those over on the table here. We also like to use these upside down T-shaped bait stations quite a bit. And we like them in part because they allow us a lot of flexibility in the design of this bait station. So one example, here's an example of a bait station where the edge has a beveled angle there. And there's another example of one of those over on the side. One of the real benefits of these, we like to use this in an orchard setting. Here in the orchards, we have micro sprinklers for irrigating the trees. When you put that bait station there, if it's a normal one with a normal opening, the sprinkler's spraying, that water will get inside that tube and it will get the grain wet. And once the grain gets wet, they will not eat it. So you need to keep the grain dry. So by having this overhang, that helps keep the water from getting into the bait station and getting it wet. So that's one adaptation that you can make. But there's lots of other adaptations. These include putting 3-inch reducers on 4-inch PVC pipe. That creates a lip that makes it difficult for the squirrels to kick the grain out onto the ground. Keep in mind, if we're using bait stations, we don't want the squirrels to kick it out onto the ground. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose of using a bait station. And so normally what happens, you put the grain or the pellets in a bait station and it flows out towards the edge. It gets pretty close to the edge. Squirrels can kick it out fairly easily if you don't have some kind of lip on that. And so by using something like that, that helps reduce that potential. Another very common example is to take end caps, cut them in half, and glue them or tape them onto each edge. Once again, that's creating a lip that keeps the squirrels from being able to kick that out onto the ground. Another option that is used, I don't have a photo of this, so I'll try to explain it with the laser pointer, but you can take 3-inch couplers, tape them together, slide them down the bait station. Imagine there's no grain in here. You can slide them down through the 4-inch PVC pipe and they'll go all the way down to the bottom. Then you pour the grain in. And now what that leaves is only a tiny little crack at the bottom in which the grain can slowly trickle out. The squirrels have no problem getting access to the bait. As they eat some, more of it trickles out. But it keeps that whole cascading event out towards the edges from happening. And so that's another great way to reduce the potential of that grain being kicked out onto the open ground. In California, we also have a lot of kangaroo rat species, and most of these are threatened or endangered. And so where we have these endangered species, that greatly reduces the tools that we can use to manage ground squirrels, and that includes bait application. But some colleagues of mine a few years back came up with a bait station design that works for ground squirrels but excludes K-rats. And that is simply by putting a 45-degree angle on the edge of these bait stations and then projecting that up. The squirrels can easily jump up and into that bait station, gain access to the bait, but the kangaroo rats cannot jump up and get access to that bait. So there's a lot of adaptability to this particular bait station design. That's part of the reason we like to use it. So that's information on the first generation anticoagulants. We also do have zinc phosphide, which is the acute toxicant that we can use for ground squirrel control. As already been alluded to, one of the potential drawbacks of zinc phosphide is that it does have a distinctive odor and taste to it that ground squirrels don't always necessarily take to. So that's a potential problem. If they're not going to consume the bait off the bat, certainly it's not going to work. But the other problem is that sometimes they'll try a little bit of it out, eat maybe 2 or 3 pellets or 2 or 3 grains of this. It'd be enough to make them get sick, but not enough to kill them. And so what happens then is they attribute that sickness back to consuming this weird tasting food, and then they will no longer eat it again. So that's called bait shyness. And because of that, we're only allowed to use zinc phosphide 1 time per year for ground squirrel control. And I'm guessing that most of the commercial labels are going to be the same way. So that means you need to be very careful when it comes to using zinc phosphide, because if you use it that one time and it doesn't work, now you have to wait until next year to be able to apply it again. So the way we hopefully maximize the efficacy of that application is to pre-bait, and that's already been talked about today. Pre-baiting can certainly help increase the efficacy of a zinc phosphide application. And I will tell you that you should be monitoring for consumption of this grain when you put it out there for pre-baiting, because if they're not going to eat the non-toxic product, they certainly are not going to eat the toxic product. So there's no reason to waste your one bait application on a time in which they're not actively feeding on that product. So you should be watching to see if they're actually feeding on this non-toxic product, because if they're not, it's not worth actually going out and applying it. When it comes to actual application techniques, we're only using spot treatments or broadcast applications. We do not use zinc phosphide in a bait station. It magnifies that odor and that taste, and they simply do not eat it. And so it's not used in those kind of situations. And also, this is an acutely toxic material, highly toxic. And so we do not use it around structures or buildings just because of the potential for children or pets to gain access to it.
What about record keeping on using these baits?
So record keeping can be a very good tool to let you know what's working, as well as the timing for when something did work. And so if you keep using these baits over 5 to 10 years, you'll start to see some patterns, and maybe those patterns can be a little bit useful for you in deciding what's working and what's not working.
Is it a regulation to do that?
So
If they're restricted, you have to.
if they're restricted use products, you have to, and zinc phosphide is a federally restricted use product, and so yes, you do. And actually, first generation anticoagulants are now a federally restricted use product as well. Interestingly, in California, they are not a state restricted use product. We still have to adhere to the federal regulations, but we don't have to do the same kind of record keeping that we normally do if it was a state restricted use product. But yes, there does have to be some record keeping along those lines. Oops. So we've talked a little bit about the use of, or the potential use at least, of a green vegetative type bait for controlling ground squirrels. In the previous 2 slides, I was talking, when I was talking about the anticoagulants and zinc phosphide, I was talking primarily about California ground squirrel control. For buildings ground squirrel control, grain baits just don't work well for them. They simply don't take that grain at a very high rate. So historically, when it came to managing buildings ground squirrels, they used to use 1080 on cabbage. And that was a very effective tool for managing ground squirrels. But most of you, or some of you at least, may know 1080 went away a long time ago, about 1990, 1991. So since that time, they have not had an effective tool for managing buildings ground squirrel up there. And so it's been a really big problem for them. Surprisingly, and unbeknownst to me, Oregon went ahead in 2014 and approved a 24C label for zinc phosphide coated cabbage on buildings ground squirrel control. I was really kind of curious about this because I've never really seen any efficacy data to suggest that this would work. The only study that I was familiar with that ever looked at it was in Nevada and against Townsend's ground squirrel, and they showed only 42% efficacy of zinc phosphide coated cabbage. So I was really kind of curious, is this something that's actually going to work? But of course, I don't know how familiar you are with California, Oregon geography, but this is all up around the Klamath Basin area, kind of close to Klamath Falls and whatnot. And a lot of the farmers up there, of course, farm in both Oregon and California. And so now they've got something they can use up in Oregon. So they're like, well, why can't we use it here in California? And so there was a big push to try to get this registered in California as well. And so as of last year, we did get a 24C in California to use zinc phosphide coated cabbage as well. So the big question, though, is will this work? And one of my potential concerns is the way that zinc phosphide works, it reacts with moisture to create phosphine, and that's what kills the animal. But when something gets wet, when it gets wet, it starts to emit that phosphine right away at relatively low levels, but it does start to emit it. And that lowers, number one, the efficacy of the product, but it also probably makes it a little bit less palatable because the animals can detect that gas coming off of it, and they don't want to eat it. And so the idea of putting zinc phosphide on a green material like cabbage, to me, didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So I did go ahead and submit a proposal to see about testing this particular product. And so we are going to have a project coming up here in the next year to look at the efficacy of that for Belding's ground squirrel. So maybe that information will be useful for all of you when it comes to managing Townsends here in Utah. But certainly if it does work, it has a lot of potential benefits, including number one, the fact that it would simply be a cheaper alternative to what they're currently doing for ground squirrel control. They don't have much in the way of options other than burrow fumigation, which can be time consuming and costly, and then also shooting. That's the other primary tool they use up there.
So Roger, that earlier question that came up, do you think that that could be applied directly to the alfalfa and still be effective?
I don't know. Part of the problem will be, the reason why they like to use cabbage is number one, it's readily available. It's a green material which theoretically they should take to, and you can cut it up into standard sizes. And you kind of need that standard size to be able to gauge what percent that you're putting on that product when it comes to the mixing situation. And so if you're using green alfalfa, I would be a little bit concerned about how well you would be able to coat the alfalfa equally. And then also how you would gauge the actual concentration of the product that you're getting onto it. So I have no idea if it would work. It was just something I think that would have to be played around with a little bit. Those would be my general concerns, though, with it. Certainly another potential benefit is that it could be much more effective than what's currently available. Most of the folks in that part of the world are relying on shooting to manage ground squirrels, and it's not a very effective tool to knock down those populations. And the other attribute, one of the real beauties of zinc phosphide is that it does not have a secondary toxicity risk. Basically, the animal consumes it, it creates phosphine inside the body, that gas kills the animal, but then the gas dissipates from the body. So something coming along and scavenging on that animal isn't going to get sick. It's not going to have any kind of negative effects on them.
What about the diphacetin and the chlorophosphate?
There is some potential for secondary toxicity with those products. It's much, much lower than with the second generation rat and mouse poisons, but there is some potential for secondary toxicity there. Strychnine has secondary toxicity concerns, definitely, yeah. It's a little bit different. With strychnine, the animal ingests the product, but it stays in the stomach. And so if something consumes the stomach, then it's going to get the remaining amount of that strychnine, and that's where the secondary toxicity comes. Whereas with the anticoagulants, it's basically coming from the liver tissue, sometimes a little bit of muscle tissue, but that's where the anticoagulant concentrates. Some of the concerns, we've talked a little bit about this. I am concerned about the palatability of using zinc phosphide on a green product, and so that's something that I'm going to be testing here in the next few months, actually. There is a potential for primary toxicity risk. There's a lot of pronghorn, a lot of deer, even elk up in this part of the world, and they wander out onto these alfalfa fields at a pretty high rate, and now we're putting green vegetative material out there that I think they might consume. So I am a little concerned about that non-target issue there, because if we start getting dead pronghorn, if we start getting dead deer, then the product's going to go away. So we need to figure out whether or not this is going to be a concern, and if it is, we need to alter our baiting strategy so that we're not going to have those kinds of non-target concerns. Then I'm also really kind of concerned about the mixing instructions on the label. Basically what it says is you cut up a certain amount of cabbage, you throw it in a 5-gallon bucket, you put some oil and the zinc phosphide powder on top of it, and you mix it up. That's the mixing process. But the problem is zinc phosphide is highly toxic, and when it's powder, it can be aerosolized, and now the person can very easily breathe that stuff in, and so that's a real concern. Also, when we're talking about mixing it up in a bucket with a spoon, how even is your distribution of zinc phosphide likely going to be on that cabbage? I think probably not all that even of a distribution. So we are going to look at a couple of different mixing tools. That's one of the mixing tools we're going to look at. The other one is we're going to use industrial sized mixers. These are used a lot in artichoke production in Monterey County. What they do is they take the bracts from the artichokes, they put them in these large mixers, put in oil and the anticoagulant, and it tumbles for like 5 minutes or so, and it does a very good job of coating all of the bracts evenly with this mixture. So you're going to get probably a much higher quality product out of that. And so we're going to look at that kind of a mixing apparatus to see if that maybe makes it a little bit more effective as well as a safer tool. So those are the different kinds of products that we currently have for ground squirrel control. The last thing I wanted to talk about on these rodenticides, I just have 2 slides on this and then we'll move on to another topic. But I did, we've talked a little bit about first generation anticoagulants, we've talked a little bit about zinc phosphide. And whether or not one is better to use than another really depends on a lot of different factors. And so I thought we'd at least quickly hit on a summary of the positive and negative attributes of these. So the first one is the first generation anticoagulants. One of the positive attributes is that it has a lower primary non-target risk. This is a multiple feed material. It is desirable to be a multiple feed material because that means consumption by non-target species has to be very deliberate over several days to get that toxic dose, and that simply does not happen in most cases, whereas the target species are adapted to feed on that regularly over several days. And so it can be very target specific, and that's a really nice attribute. Also, there is an antidote available for anticoagulants. It's vitamin K. So if a pet or a child happens to get into some of these products, you can take them to the vet or the doctor, tell them what it consumed, they administer vitamin K and they will be fine. This is the only rodenticide that we have that actually has an antidote. The others do not, and so that's a potential concern. Good bait acceptance. There is no odor or taste associated with this product, so we do not have to be worried about bait acceptance. And it's readily available. It's probably the easiest of the products out there to find. Negatives. It does require a larger amount of bait. The animal does have to consume the bait multiple times over several days, so you have to use more of it. So that makes it more expensive. There is some potential for secondary toxicity. If an animal, a coyote for example, eats several ground squirrels that died from this product, that might be enough to cause mortality. So that's at least a potential concern. And you do have a slower time to death with these products than you do with the acute toxicants, meaning that sometimes it might take 2 or 3 weeks to get complete knockdown of a population, even if it's working well. Whereas with a zinc phosphide application, you will get knocked down usually within 24 to 48 hours. So you can imagine ground squirrels are going to cause a lot more damage if they're feeding for 2 or 3 weeks as opposed to just 1 or 2 days. And so that's a potential positive for zinc phosphide. It's less expensive than the anticoagulants because you're using less of it. It's actually a little bit more expensive per pound generally speaking, but you use a lot less pounds of it. And there is no secondary toxicity risk. We talked about that. Negative attributes, it's acutely toxic. So your risk of primary toxicity is much higher. In this case, if a deer or a dog or anything like that happened to consume enough of this product at one time, that will be fatal to them. Bait acceptance can be poor. We've talked about that. We've also talked a little bit earlier today about the influence of precipitation. You have to be careful when you use it. Not only will rain and irrigation events affect it, so will fog, and so will morning dew, and things along those lines. And so you need to apply it when you're going to have relatively dry conditions for this product to work. And there is no antidote for it. There certainly are steps that can be taken to ameliorate some of the effects of consuming this product, but there is no true antidote. So that takes us to fumigation. With fumigants, we're talking about introducing toxic gases into burrow systems. These burrow fumigants generally work best when soil moisture is high. So that means usually in springtime in California, it means in springtime that we use these. I don't know, what is your soil moisture like in February, March, April?
It's good and then it goes downhill fast.
Okay, all right. So that would still be an ideal time then to go ahead and use these burrow fumigants. Somebody had mentioned, I forget who it was, but somewhere around in this part of the room, had mentioned that usually waiting a couple of weeks until after you start to see the first ground squirrels emerge. That is a very good idea. The first ones that emerge usually are the males. You want to wait till the females emerge as well. So waiting around 2 weeks after you start to see those first ground squirrels pop up is usually a good time to start thinking about initiating a fumigation plan. Certainly with fumigants, we don't want to use them around buildings for reasons we've already talked about today. But remember, these burrow systems can go a ways, and so you do have to be a ways away from these structures before you can use them. The label of the product that you're using will tell you how far away you have to be. I can tell you with aluminum phosphide, it's now 100 feet from any structure that is or may potentially be occupied by humans, pets, or livestock. So you have to be quite a ways away from these structures before you can use them. Which takes us to aluminum phosphide. Certainly one of the more effective tools. In fact, I would argue that aluminum phosphide is probably the most effective tool we have for managing ground squirrel populations. Studies that I have been involved with show around 97 to 100% efficacy of California ground squirrels and 98% for Belding's ground squirrels. So we're talking very, very high levels of efficacy when these products are used appropriately. Of course, how they're used, they're tablets that you basically insert into the burrow system. You then usually cover that opening up with something along the lines of newspaper, grass, something along those lines, basically just to keep the soil from covering up those tablets, and then you put soil around that opening. And it reacts with the moisture in that burrow system to create phosphine, which kills the animal. The one caveat that we always want to make, and this is expressly written in the label, but you really should not be adding water into these burrow systems before you put the tablets in or after you put them in, for two reasons. Yes, it is important we have sufficient soil moisture. That is definitely true. But you don't want to artificially do that by pouring water in there because, number one, these tablets can react with water directly. They can combust. In other words, they will explode. It's not common, but it can happen, and it has happened on a number of occasions. So that's one reason we don't want to do it. The second reason that we don't want to do it.
Explosions are very common.
Are they for you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Generally speaking, the people I've talked to haven't had those concerns, but that's good to know then, because that's just one more reason you really don't want to do that. The second reason you really don't want to do it is, yes, if you put the water in and then you put the tablets on it, that may increase its ability to off-gas to some extent, but this gas is going to travel down the entire burrow system, right? So if the rest of the burrow system is dry, that gas is still going to dissipate through those cracks, and it's still not going to work very well. And so you're going to lose the efficacy, and you're going to create a more hazardous situation.
Would it help to diss the area out except for a few holes before you put it down?
Right. So the question basically gets at it from the point that you don't want to have to treat thousands and thousands of burrow openings. If you can get rid of all the ones that they're not using, then you know they're not using it and just treat the ones that are active. Is that the point you're getting at?
Yeah, I guess, and then you say, okay, they're using it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is a good tool. That is a good way to help reduce the number of burrow systems that you have to treat by figuring out which ones are active and ignoring the ones that are not active anymore. And that way also, if some of them were connected together, you've kind of plugged up some of those other openings so you don't get that gas dissipating. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good tool. Now, I did mention, pouring the water down the burrow system is not a good idea, but if you do have an irrigation event later in the year, when the soil is typically dry, but by irrigating now it's all nice and wet, you can certainly do the aluminum phosphide application at that point in time. That can be effective. But just the last thing I wanted to mention with aluminum phosphide, this is the most restrictive product we have out there. So you certainly do need to know how to use it. You do need to be certified to use it. You need to realize where you can apply it. In other words, you have to be far enough away from buildings. There is a posting requirement. You have to post treated sites for 48 hours now. You did not used to have to do that. You do have to file a fumigation management plan when you're going to use this product. So there are some extra steps to jump through, but it is a very efficacious tool. And so it's worth it if you have continual problems with ground squirrels. Now, we also use gas cartridges quite a bit as a burrow fumigant. These are basically glorified smoke bombs. You light the fuse and shove that down into the burrow system and cover that opening up. Then asphyxiates the animal with carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and a few other gases. No. No, this is not like that. Yes. Efficacy is pretty good with these, somewhere around 75% on average efficacy. So pretty good, not as good as aluminum phosphide, but pretty good. The real advantage to gas cartridges is that they are not a restricted use product. So you don't have any of those hurdles to jump through. You can go to the store right now and buy gas cartridges for use. Anybody can. So that's a really nice attribute about them. You do, though, of course, have to be a little bit careful. They have a tendency to flare up. I know many people who've started fires with gas cartridges, too. So you got to be careful where you're using them. And then the other fumigant that we have are carbon monoxide producing machines. These, historically in California, were not legal for use. They were legal most everywhere else, but not in California. Go figure. But as of January 1st, 2012, They are now legal for use in California, so we've now started to test them for efficacy. Some of the different products out there include the PERC machine. The PERC machine is probably the most common example. PERC stands for Pressurized Exhaust Rodent Controller. It's basically a small engine that creates exhaust, pumps it through these coils to cool it off, and then stores it in a large compressor. You then use hoses and probes to inject that gas into the burrow system. These are pocket gopher burrow systems, but it's the same premise for ground squirrels as well. Another device out there is called the Cheetah Rodent Controller. It's more or less just a modified leaf blower to inject exhaust into the burrow system. There's another one that I know of that's being made called the Gopher X as well, and I haven't tested that one. Some of the potential advantages for using carbon monoxide machines are, number one, that they're safer for the user. Certainly carbon monoxide is a very toxic gas, but when you're applying it, that gas is going directly into the burrow system. So as opposed to aluminum phosphide, where you have to open the canister to put the tablets in and you're getting some exposure to that phosphine, you're usually not getting too much exposure to carbon monoxide. So it's a little bit safer from that perspective. And also it allows for multiple applications. If you look at this device, you can see that there are 4 different hoses on this device. So you can treat 4 burrow systems at once. They actually make one that allows you to treat 6 burrow systems at once. So you can theoretically move through an area much more rapidly than you would be able to with aluminum phosphide or gas cartridges or something like that. Now, when these devices were first approved, they were actually not regulated by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. They were considered a device and not a pesticide. So that meant we could use these things in areas where we would not be able to use some of the other burrow fumigants. But they've since changed their mind, and so we now have the same regulations that other burrow fumigants have. Of course, one of the big questions, though, is how efficacious are these tools? And so that's where some of the work that I've been involved with, as well as a colleague of mine, Steve Orloff, has been involved with when looking at efficacy. Steve did some of the initial work, and he did his work with Belding's ground squirrel. And what he found is that after treating 2 fields, he had about a 76% reduction in ground squirrel activity at these sites. So it is pretty darn effective. We consider anything over 70% to be a pretty efficacious tool. And so it was working pretty darn well for Belding's ground squirrels. Finally, I got around to testing it for California ground squirrels. This was about 2 years ago. And I initially tested it in a couple fields, and I had 66% removal rates. Initially, this seemed a little bit low, but I was quite happy with these results because this study was done in extremely hot, extremely dry soil conditions when burrow fumigants should not be used. They theoretically shouldn't work well at all. And I can tell you if I'd have used aluminum phosphide or gas cartridges, I wouldn't have had anywhere near this level of success. So I actually thought 66% was quite good. So finally last year, I got around to testing it in more ideal conditions, and in those situations, we had 100% removal rates of California ground squirrels when using the PERC machine. So I do think the PERC machine is probably a very effective tool when it comes to managing ground squirrels. And so that's another potential option that you do have for dealing with California ground squirrels. I'm sorry, with ground squirrels in general. The other device that I talked a little bit about was the Cheetah Rodent Controller. That's the leaf blower type device. And this was actually a pretty extensive study, tested across 3 different sites. And actually what we found is that we had more ground squirrels after treatment than before treatment. So Cheetah, not so excited about. PERC machine seems to be a pretty good tool. Now there's another device in California, it's called the Eliminator, and instead of using carbon monoxide per machine. So you have to use it a lot to make it worthwhile. Some growers are actually going in together, 3 or 4 growers saying, hey, let's get together. Yeah, all with the same machine. So that's one way you can maybe split costs there. And I'll show you some data right now about cost comparisons between using some of these. Yeah, you had a question first?
So you just said 15 to 20 per acre.
Yeah.
These guys are dealing with 1,500 to 2,000 per acre.
Yeah, well, not squirrels, but openings, yeah.
No squirrels.
Well, I thought you were dealing with like 150 to 200 squirrels per acre or something like that. Which is still an extraordinarily high number, yes, yes. I'll show you some data in the slide after this one that kind of gets at that a little bit. Not quite, but a little bit. So this data is for the California ground squirrel. So your take-home message will have to be thought of from that perspective. But what we have on this particular chart is efficacy data for 4 of the more commonly used techniques for ground squirrel control. We have cost per acre for treatment type along the y-axis over here on the left-hand side. And This data is collected over several different studies, so it's not a real head-to-head comparison. So you got to take this with a whole lot of grains of salt, if you will. What I want you to get instead is just some general trends on what the cost is going to be for some of these approaches.
Curious, Roger, just for our knowledge. You know, because with the Townsend, they tend to stick mostly to roads. They
Okay.
don't really move too far into fields generally.
Mhm.
Is that what you see with the Baldwin and the California Roger Baldwin, or do they move
No.
throughout the field? They just spread out evenly?
They go throughout the field. Yeah, they do.
Yours will move into the field in a couple of years.
Yeah, if you give it enough time and you don't control them, they will. Yeah.
Especially if you use the rippers for the.
Because you're spreading them out.
So what you see from this particular slide, number one, when it comes to efficacy, you know, once again, aluminum phosphide is the best that we have out there. Although we could easily move this perk machine value on up too as well. What I've done is taken the average between the dry and the wet conditions here. But if we consider just the wet soil conditions, you know, it's going to be about 100% as well. But the other tools that we're looking at are still highly efficacious as well. Gas cartridges above 75%. Broadcast applications of difasone averaging about 82, 83% efficacy. So all of these are definitely efficacious tools that we have. But the cost per acre for treatment is much higher for some of these, obviously. Perk machine, gas cartridges, very expensive. Now the caveat with the gas cartridges, with the perk machine, it's very difficult to assign a value to it because you have the cost of the machine and then you're going to have to amortize that out over time, right? So if you use it a lot over 10 years, for example, this cost is going to go way down. If you just use it a little bit, this cost is going to be really high. So you have to figure that in when thinking about the cost of the perk machine. Gas cartridges, this is pretty much a fixed cost. That's what gas cartridges cost. They're about $2 to $2.50 a piece, depending upon what you buy. So that's pretty expensive. Aluminum phosphide is much cheaper. Application times aren't that different between the two, but the cost of material is much cheaper. You're looking at 18 to 36 cents per burrow system versus $2 to $2.50 per burrow system for gas cartridges. So aluminum phosphide is definitely cheaper and more efficacious. So I consider aluminum phosphide to be a much more practical approach than gas cartridges. The advantage of gas cartridges, if you have just a few burrow systems to treat, you can buy gas cartridges, use them, not worry about all the permitting and paperwork that you need to do with aluminum phosphide. But if you have very extensive areas to treat, aluminum phosphide is much better. All that being said, the difasone treatments are half the cost of aluminum phosphide yet. So the bait application is going to probably be the cheapest tool you have, while still also being highly efficacious. So this may be the one that you prefer to use as much as possible. But realize these burrow fumigants are still going to be needed in a lot of cases. And if you don't have a bait that your squirrels are actually taking at a very high rate, the fumigants may be your best option, period. Which takes us to the Belding's ground squirrel data we have for cost comparisons, because this is probably a little bit more reflective of your situations. But once again, all of this data has to be taken with a grain of salt because all of this data will vary across space and across time. So for example, this is from a study I was involved with about 4 years ago. This is what they were producing tons per acre in that area for that particular year. This was the cost per ton that they were getting for hay for that particular year, but all of these values are going to change over time, right? This loss per acre was based on some past work that a colleague of mine did where they found that when Belding's ground squirrels were found at moderate to moderately high levels, this is the kind of reduction they saw in production per acre for the first and second cutting. So if we take all that information, multiply it out, basically what we were seeing was a loss of $178 per acre in the first cutting and $60 from the second cutting for a total of $238 lost per acre. So that gives you an idea of what you may potentially be able to spend to try to manage those ground squirrels to see some kind of net gain. And so if this study was based strictly on fumigants, and in this case strictly on aluminum phosphide and gas cartridges, but when we looked at the cost per application at that particular point in time, we estimated around $1.05 per application when you considered labor and material costs. That meant we could treat up to 227 burrow systems per acre to recoup that cost. Gas cartridges, much fewer, only 82 burrow systems per acre because of the increased cost and increased labor associated with using gas cartridges. So it gives you an idea of where it might be cost effective for treating burrow fumigants for ground squirrel control. But as I mentioned, all of these values are going to vary across time and across different regions, so you have to keep that in mind. This is just a general guide to give you an idea of what may or may not be practical.
For it to spread, so to me the cost still goes down because the potential for that to spread into the areas you don't.
Oh, sure. That's another aspect that you have to keep in mind. You're absolutely correct on that, yeah. And I have no idea what that cost per spread would be, but yeah, absolutely.
Whenever we're trying to control anything we're using, we might treat like a 10-acre piece one day, come out the next day, and a whole new set was moved into those holes that we treated.
Okay. That would be really rapid reinvasion. We don't typically, in California at least, we don't see that rapid of reinvasion. We do see reinvasion over time. But usually it's more like a month to 2 months, depending upon how close the next population is. If it's immediately next door, they're going to move back in pretty quickly. If it's a little bit further away, it's going to take a little bit more time. Okay.
Is there a way to stop them from reinvading?
Not really, other than just to continue to try to treat the areas when they reinvade, as well as to try to treat the perimeter of those sites. Now, this is getting to a different species, but there was a guy up in Canada who did some work. There's a guy up in Canada who did some work with pocket gophers, and he found, because it's the same problem across all the different rodent species out there, you're always going to get that reinvasion. And he found that if you continually trap the gophers around the edge of that field as they move back into that field, if you kept doing it, after about 9 to 12 months, he actually caught all the gophers that were on the adjacent property, more or less, as well, and they no longer had that much immigration back onto the property. So it took a very concerted effort for a long period of time, but they eventually got to the point where that went down, and I suspect it's going to be the same situation for you. You're going to really have to be diligent for a long period of time, but if you are, you may eventually get to the point where you can slow that movement back down. But it's going to take time, and that's not the news anybody wants to hear, but that's about the only truth to it. We do have a few other tools that we can use for ground squirrel control as well. One of these is shooting. Shooting tends to be most effective for small populations, but people do use them for larger populations as well. The key component for shooting is you must be diligent. You must be persistent. You can't throw a gun in the back of your truck and shoot a squirrel every now and then when you see one. You have to consider it in the same manner that you would a bait application approach. You need to reduce populations by around 70% to have any kind of long-term effect, and realistically it should be closer to 90%. So shooting can be done, but you have to be very, very persistent with it. You also have to be cognizant of the use of lead bullets. In California, at least, we have a California condor range. We can't use lead bullets in that area. I don't know if you have that stipulation here in Utah or not. We're actually going to have it one step further. In 2019, lead's going to be banned statewide in California, so that's going to be a real problem. Gas explosive devices, we've talked a little bit about these. Basically injecting a mixture of propane and oxygen into the burrow system and then blowing it up. I haven't done any studies for California ground squirrels. I've done some work with gophers, but some colleagues of mine did this particular study for ground squirrels, and they only saw about a 30 to 35% reduction. So not near as efficacious as some of the other tools out there. There are also some potential hazards. You know, you got things blowing up, that can be kind of scary. You can start large fires, which they happened to start a very nice fire and got into a lot of trouble that way. They're also really loud, several times louder than a shotgun blast, and so you have to be a little bit concerned about where you're using them. Certainly you don't want to use them next to neighbors and places like that. So for me, it's not one of the more effective tools that we have for ground squirrels. Oops. And then the last one, we did talk a little bit about burrow ripping today. I don't have data for Belding's ground squirrel. I do have some data for California ground squirrels and the efficacy of ripping. What Terry Salmon did this work, a colleague of mine, a number of years ago, and what he found is you needed to get down to at least 1.5 to 2 feet deep to have any kind of impact with burrow ripping. Anything only around 1 foot deep had no impact whatsoever on slowing reinvasion rates. And by the way, this is principally for reinvasion rates. It's not as a control technique is how they looked at it. So they'd go out there, they'd remove ground squirrels, and then they'd come through and rip those burrow systems up. Because when you get rid of ground squirrels, the burrow systems stay. and that allows for that rapid reinvasion. If you can get rid of those burrow systems, that actually slows down that reinvasion rate because now they have to create all new burrow systems again. So deep ripping did have an impact. Plugging up those openings did not have an impact. In fact, they actually went out and poured concrete down all the openings and found that it had zero effect whatsoever. The squirrels just basically created a new opening right next to it, dug right down to the part that didn't get filled with concrete, and then they had the same burrow systems again. So I wouldn't think concrete would be a good solution. So that's mostly it. You know, basically in summary, this is just rehashing all the stuff we've talked about today, but timing is really important. You need to figure out what tools work and what times they work and time them appropriately. I certainly would recommend using multiple techniques to maximize efficacy of these management programs. And in general, I suspect your best tools are going to be burrow fumigation and bait application when it comes to managing ground squirrels here. That's pretty much all I've got today. I'll take some more questions if anybody has any, but the last thing I did want to address is somebody had a question about more or less fertility drugs. Is there any kind of fertility control we can use for ground squirrels? It's been looked at a little bit. Long term, I don't think it's ever going to have a lot of utility in an ag production area. I think it's going to be a specialized situation for people who live in towns like Berkeley who don't want to kill ground squirrels. There is some efficacy associated with it, but you have to inoculate at least 70% of the population for it to work, if not more. And right now there is no oral delivery mechanism, meaning you have to live trap and inject by hand the product to the squirrel. That's probably not going to be overly practical. So until they develop an oral delivery mechanism, it's probably not ever going to be a management tool.